Welcome to my podcast, and I'm sitting here for a little bit of banter and fun and chat with a wonderful author called Alex Norman, who has also achieved many other roles in his life, but currently is here to talk about de Havilland's Moth and a wonderful story around the 1920s. We have such an amazing link with de Havilland, so I couldn't wait to invite Alex here. So welcome, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Can I actually first of all ask you, why did you choose this subject for this book?
Funnily enough, rather like yours, my family had a long-standing connection with de Havilland's. My grandfather was within the first 40, I think, people in this country to own a private aeroplane during the 1920s.
Wow.
He learned to fly after the war and bought a war surplus trainer called an Avro 504. And he learned to fly on that. And he was an architect by profession. And he founded an airport, or an airfield, called Heston, which is better known today as London Heathrow. Actually, that's a slight exaggeration. The boundaries of Heston were just beyond Heathrow, and Heston no longer obviously exists anymore. But yes, so that was, and he set up a company called Airwork, and he also was a member of the London Aeroplane Club, which came into being in the mid-1920s and was intimately involved with the sort of private flying movement, if you want to call it that, and was very friendly with a chap called Alan Butler. And the story of how Alan Butler came to be chairman of de Havilland's was that Geoffrey de Havilland, who grew up very close to here, grew up near here at the Crux Easton, where his father was a clergyman.
And in fact, he was Lord Carnarvon's rector. So he grew up there, fascinated by engineering and cars and early automobiles. The Fifth Earl was one of the earliest automobile drivers in this country. And I think it was passed on some of his old cars as well. And of course was also fascinated by early plane technology. So when Geoffrey de Havilland was building his plane with his engineer, they obviously built it in a shooting hut which had been borrowed by Moore Brabazon at the foot of Beacon Hill. So that's where he was based. And we've got some amazing photographs because Lord Carnarvon used to go down there and watch because he wanted to go up in the plane as well.
How brilliant.
In 1909, and then 1910 was the seminal year, which we then celebrated 100 years later in 2010, when 100 moths landed in the very same field.
Oh, wonderful.
And we celebrated de Havilland and all his achievements. And from that year, I then began to meet so many marvellous men in their flying machines and begin to delve into the history of de Havilland, the Moth, obviously later on the Mosquito. But that was my introduction to a whole raft of simply glorious pilots. So I interrupted you. So you're right, he was up there at Crux Easton.
Yeah. So yes, as you probably know, Geoffrey de Havilland went on to, having been only the second person to actually build an aeroplane in this country. And incidentally, he designed it completely from scratch without any knowledge whatsoever of, he'd never actually seen an aeroplane fly.
No, I know, it's extraordinary because I've written all about that, and though the wings were sewn by his wife and it was made with piano wire and bicycle wheels. But I think every single early aviator seemed to be a bicycle maker, from the Wright brothers in America to Farman and Voisin obviously stayed here as well.
Absolutely.
So it's fascinating, and the give and take to and fro. We've got some very early photographs by Lord Carnarvon of the Farman and Voisin planes in France where he would watch them take off. So
wonderful.
It is extraordinary, and there he was, and I've got a photograph of where he built the plane. Yeah. We found a few old spanners, although the shed's gone now. But great fun.
Geoffrey de Havilland, having successfully built and flown, I say successfully, the first one crashed rather spectacularly, but luckily he wasn't badly hurt. But the second aeroplane that he built, he managed to sell to the Ministry of War.
Yes.
And he then went on to have a very successful wartime career, designing and building aircraft for the war effort. And in fact, at the end of the war, the de Havilland designs were far and away the most successful in terms of numbers of all the British manufacturers. After the war, everybody thought that flying was this was it. The aeroplane had proved itself capable of flying to Berlin and back, and everybody knew that aeroplanes or aviation was the next big thing. It was rather like AI today. Everybody knows that AI is going to be the next big thing. Everybody knew after the war that aeroplanes were going to be the next big thing, except nobody had any money, of course. And so people like de Havilland, who had huge manufacturing facilities, he was actually working for somebody else at the time, somebody by the name of Holt. Of course, when the war ended, the demand for aeroplanes ended, and suddenly they found themselves, instead of building aeroplanes, they were doing things like manufacturing garden furniture, miscellaneous things like that. Eventually everybody was laid off, of course. De Havilland managed to salvage something from this and decided to set up his own company with a certain amount of money of his own, and he got money from here, there and everywhere, and produced what was then one of the first airliners to operate between London and Paris, amongst other places. He got an order from Daimler to design and build this airplane. And things were going not too badly in about 1922, 23, but the place that he was by this time based was just outside London, at a place called Stag Lane Aerodrome. And when the proprietors of Stag Lane saw that he was doing rather well, they said, unfortunately, we're going to have to sell the place. We're going to have to sell the aerodrome. And so I'm afraid, unless you can buy it off us, I'm afraid that's the end of things. At which point, de Havilland said, we can't possibly, we haven't got £10,000, which I think, as I recall, was the asking price. So what are we going to do? It was at that moment that Mr. Alan S. Butler, a young man of only 23, appeared on the doorstep and said to de Havilland, if he could see his way to doing so, to build him an aeroplane suitable for taking his young wife, Lois, on a touring holiday of Europe. No expense to be spared. So de Havilland scratched his head and he thought, OK, we'll dream up a number and tell him we can do it and see what happens. We'll name a price sufficient to save the company and enable us to buy the aerodrome. And if the chap isn't a complete lunatic, he'll turn it down and that'll be the end of things. But no, when de Havilland quoted him a price of £3,000 to build this aeroplane, Butler accepted at once. And as a result, the company was saved. They bought Stag Lane, and the rest, as they say, is history. Alan Butler then became chairman of de Havilland's and retired, in the 1950s, by which time it was employing around 50,000 people around the world. So a huge success story.
But obviously he also rented out planes to Havilland at that time. And Lady Carnarvon, the fifth countess, rented a plane from him in 1923 to fly down to Egypt to get to her husband's side.
Oh, very interesting. Yes, I knew that the Duchess of Bedford did exactly the same thing. She also hired an aeroplane from de Havilland's to undertake a lengthy aerial voyage, as they were known in those days. It was a remarkable story, which really took off in 1925 with the birth of the DH60 Moth series of aircraft. What de Havilland realised was that nobody, apart from people like Butler, could afford to spend £3,000 on an aeroplane. The problem was that they only had available engines that had been designed with no thought of cost in mind during the war. And so they were extremely expensive to run. There was no thought of fuel economy or anything like that. What de Havilland realised was that the key to light aviation was the design of a lightweight engine that could put out a sufficient amount of power to be able to carry two people, ideally 300 to 500 miles at 75 miles an hour. No such engine existed. But he took out of an aeroplane that he designed earlier an engine which was essentially a Renault aero engine designed during the First World War. It was a V engine, so the cylinders were arranged in a V. And he had one taken out of the aeroplane and plonked on a workbench. And he had this brilliant young designer working for him, engineer working for him, called Frank Halford. And he said to Frank Halford, look, this engine, this Renault engine, has got 8 cylinders, it's a V8. What about if you just take 4 of those cylinders and put them on redesign the crankshaft, and you've got an inline 4-cylinder engine? Couldn't we do that? And Halford scratched his head and thought, sounds rather extraordinary, but he'd give it a go. The short version of the story is that he came up with this engine called the Cirrus engine, which exceeded de Havilland's specifications and produced 60 horsepower, weighed under 300 pounds, and around which de Havilland designed this aeroplane called the Moth, which first flew in 1925 and was an instant hit, because suddenly here was an aeroplane that was genuinely just about affordable. Of course, it wasn't really affordable to people who worked on farms and in factories, but it was within plausible reach. By this time, 1925, the economy had started to pick up. There were certain industries that were doing well, the chemical industry being one of them, automotive industry being another one. People were beginning to have a bit of money in their pockets. And at £600, the Moth was jolly expensive. It was 3 times the average working man's wage, but nevertheless, it was somewhat affordable for the rising middle class. At this time, the government was trying to encourage private flying through the establishment of aero clubs, which the government was subsidising. The idea being that they would produce a cohort, if you like, of pilots in the event we ever went back to war, who could be drawn upon to go into the Royal Air Force. So it was this fact that was absolutely crucial. The government was subsidising these aero clubs, the London Aero Club being an example, Leicestershire Aero Club, the Newcastle Aero Club. There were clubs at the major cities all around the country. And each one of them, having seen and tested the de Havilland Moth, realised that this was the answer to their prayers. And so you had this movement of young men and, fascinatingly, women.
Yes.
Huge numbers of women.
Comparatively, there were quite a few women who wished to learn to fly, and it was very devilishly fashionable.
Yes, exactly. And you found that the sort of young ladies who would be at the front of the pack out hunting, many of them took to the air as well.
There was a series of moths he developed, weren't there?
There was, yes. The first moth was known as a Cirrus Moth. It was called a Cirrus Moth because it had a Cirrus engine. The next iteration was the Gypsy Moth. It was actually the same design, the same aeroplane. It just had a Gypsy engine, which Frank Halford designed specially for de Havilland. And after the Gypsy Moth, there came various others, the Puss Moth, the Leopard Moth, the Hornet Moth, various other moths.
Where did the Tiger Moth come in?
The Tiger Moth was actually quite a late
Was it quite late?
That really came into its own in the late 30s.
But there are quite a few tiger moths still around there.
Yes, and the reason...
So that's what I have overhead quite often.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason for that is because the Tiger Moth became the official training aeroplane of the Royal Air Force at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, and continued to be the single most prevalent or popular training aeroplane, not just, of course, in this country, but throughout the Commonwealth. So you've got Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And it was produced in huge numbers. After the war, the heyday of de Havilland's was over by then. I would say that the heyday of the de Havilland aircraft, de Havilland's private aircraft, were in the 20s and 30s.
It was 24 to 34, wasn't it, really? It was that middle part. And then I think perhaps 36 as well. And then we were beginning on that drum roll towards a different time of journey of all our lives.
Yes.
Or grandparents' lives.
But the great thing was that for that brief period when the ordinary person, or not just the ordinary person, but anybody, whether they were highborn or lowborn, if they could either scramble together the money or they could get onto a training scheme, they could learn to fly. And it was also at this time, of course, there were no rules of the air particularly. You could go anywhere you liked, any height that you liked, in any weather that you liked, and land anywhere that you liked. And of course the Moth was extremely capable landing in a field. If it was good enough for sheep, it was probably good enough for a moth of one description or another. Of course, as soon as you give people an opportunity like this, they want to see how far they can push it, how far they can take it. And it was then that you get these amazing flights by people like Lady Bailey, for example, who, having learned to fly secretly because her husband was sure not to approve, having learned to fly within 3 weeks, she was the first female to fly solo across the Irish Sea. using, it must be said, a half-inflated motorcycle tire as her life jacket. And she then went on to set an altitude record. And then she decided, that's all very good. What about air racing? This was another thing that was very popular at the time during the mid to late 20s. And so she came third in her first air race. But even that wasn't enough for her. So she thought, how about she fly the aeroplane to South Africa? She'd fly to visit her husband, Abe, who lived in half the year in Cape Town. And so she set off in her Moth. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. These aeroplanes I flew on, actually. I flew the DH60 Moth for the first time only last year. It is so basic. It's nothing. It weighs a few £100. It's doped linen, as you say. It's piano wire and fabric and bits of wood and not much else. And yet people were flying them to Cape Town and back, as Lady Bailey did. Or famously, of course, Amy Johnson flew hers to Sydney. Astonishing, absolutely astonishing. A bit like saying that you're going to drive your lawnmower or your Citroën deux Chevaux across the Sahara Desert, which, of course, you can do nowadays and nobody thinks twice. But then there were no maps. Lady Bailey was using a postcard, for goodness sake, to navigate her way around Africa. Something cut out of a shipping brochure. There were no such thing as aeronautical charts. But I must tell you the story of my favourite story of these great adventures is the story of Aspy Engineer. So that in 1930, the Aga Khan let it be known that he would put up the money for the Aga Khan Trophy. And this was the first Indian national to fly between London and Karachi. Didn't matter in which direction. It was the first person to cover the distance solo in a light aircraft in under a month. And there were three competitors in the end, three serious competitors. They were a chap called Singh, who was studying at the time at Bristol University an aeronautical engineering degree. Another chap called J.R.D. Tata, of Tata Steel fame, or he was the son of. He was the rising businessman who turned Tata into this massive, now huge industrial complex. And the third person was a chap called Aspy Engineer, who was a young Parsi. Actually, Tata was also a Parsi, Zoroastrian, of Persian heritage. And anyway, they all set off roughly at the same time.
Were they all flying in the same direction?
No, that's interesting, an interesting question. Two of them were going from Croydon and towards Karachi, and J.R.D. Tata was coming from Karachi to London. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Aspy Engineer had actually flown his aeroplane out to England and was now flying it back. He'd flown it out with a friend and was soloing it back. And when they adjusted it for time, they discovered that, yes, Aspy Engineer had won. An amazing story, made still more amazing by the fact that when he arrived back at Karachi, incidentally on the same day as Amy Johnson, when he arrived back in Karachi, he was not yet 6 months past his 17th birthday.
Oh, my goodness. Perhaps that's what you do when you're young. You're not afraid of that much. So it's when courage is only slightly curtailed from recklessness.
Yes, absolutely. You won't be at all surprised to hear that Aspy Engineer went on to become Marshal of the Indian Air Force.
How amazing.
Really tremendous.
They were extraordinary people, weren't they? The way they just had the courage. I sometimes wonder whether it came out of the tragedy and the horrendous loss of World War I that you thought you are nevertheless going to fill, to quote Rudyard Kipling, 60 seconds of every minute with life run, and you just get on and did it. But it was an extraordinarily exciting time. Funnily enough, in a different way, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon was a huge motorist. He'd wanted to fly with de Havilland, but he'd had a terrible accident just after he'd driven from here in a Belgian Metallurgique in 1909 from Highclere to Constantinople.
Wow.
And then on his way back, he had a terrible accident. So he nearly died, and he came back and was here in September 1909 when de Havilland made his unsuccessful attempt to fly, and then the following year when he did. I just couldn't believe it. You seemed to buy your petrol from chemists, and your boot was full of spare parts, which is probably thoroughly sensible.
Yeah,
but
what is extraordinary is how people very early on started doing these incredibly ambitious journeys, whether by car or by plane. My great-grandfather, similarly, we've got at home this wonderful article that he wrote, A Motoring Holiday in Morocco, 1908.
My goodness. And the roads must have been so bone-shattering as well,
yes,
let alone all the tyres.
And they'd load the cars into boats to get across a
Yes.
river. There were no bridges capable of taking
No,
car.
it's quite extraordinary. It is an amazing time that of the early aviation. I just find it completely fascinating. I've obviously done quite a lot of research for the various books I've written around it, and Geoffrey de Havilland really remains one of my heroes. And later on in World War II, he designed, almost against the better judgment of the RAF, the Mosquito, and this extraordinary plane, which in that case was able just to fly at 400, I think it was 20 miles per hour, whereas
Exactly.
Lancaster was 180 or 170 miles per hour, which allowed the Mosquito bombers to get in and out and avoid more things and avoid some of the German fighters looking for them. An amazing man, and you would never have known, I think, you were flying in a little wooden airplane. Absolutely amazing. And then the Comet, and we're still left with his legacy today. But I thank you so much for coming in today. We have a summer party here every year, and we have different special events for friends of Highclere. But if you were coming to a summer party here and a summer dance, and you could bring absolutely anybody, who would be your dream partner?
Goodness me, what a question. I think it would have to be Beryl Markham. Beryl Markham was the first woman to fly west with the night, solo, across the Atlantic. The last time I saw my grandmother, she asked me, as she always used to, what are you reading at the moment? I said, oh, I'm reading a book called West with the Night by Beryl Markham. She said, oh, Beryl Markham, yes. The last time I saw her, she was in the arms of the Prince of Wales, under the wings of your grandfather's puss moth. It was the London Aeroplane Club summer party in 1930. But she went on to have an extraordinary career. She was also something of a femme fatale. She had, if it's not indiscreet to say so, she was carrying on simultaneous affairs with the Prince of Wales and his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, at this time. She was also the femme fatale in the Out of Africa story with Dennis Finch-Hatton. She was also having an affair with Dennis Finch-Hatton at the time that he had his accident in the DH60 Moth.
Did she reach a good age?
She
No.
certainly did. She
Good.
died in her 80s.
Oh, good. She smoked and drink a lot. I hope she
She
did.
smoked, she drank, she swore like a trooper.
And she slept with lots of different men. It was
And
wonderful.
it was once said that her husband used to drive a copper nail into the bedroom door for every affair that
Golly.
that his young wife had. Anyway, but for all that, she was a woman of extraordinary skill and courage. So yes, and she knew everybody. So
You'd have
why
an
not
awfully
a
good
fling?
time. That sounds excellent. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining me. And I have so enjoyed your books, and may you continue to write more of them. And please pick them up on Amazon or in any good bookshop. Captain de Havilland's Moth. It should be fresh onto your own bookshelves. I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. Geoffrey de Havilland was an amazing man, so it's a really fun story about planes at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.